opening our Bibles, our minds to Romans chapter 13, and I've got circled verse 6 in my Bible. Making your way there. If you're joining us by way of technology, those who are in person, we should already be there by now, Romans 13. Again, this is the application section of the book of Romans, and we sort of divide chapter 13 into three sections. We're going to wrap up the first section here in a moment. The Christian and the law of the land, and then we'll talk about the Christian and the law of love, verses 8 to 10, and then the Christian and the law of living, verses 11 through 14. I don't know that we'll cover all that tonight. A lot of phrases in these verses, and we'll look at them as we are able and have time this evening. So the first section, the Christian and the law of the land, and we dealt with these verses at length last Wednesday evening, pointing out that we do have the responsibility as God's people to submit to the laws of the land. Every law of the land, unless what? Unless those laws conflict with God's laws, and then God's laws always take precedence over any law. God is number one, and so thankfully we live in a society thus far where we don't have to worry about that a whole lot, the laws of the land conflicting with the laws of God. But God comes first, and Paul has elaborated on the fact that government is good. Good government is good for our benefit. And in fact, the government has the right to punish evildoers, to keep society safe, and for that we are thankful. So we ought to be subject, verse 5. Now, we ended last week with verse number 6, and Adam, if you will, read for us Romans 13, well, verses 6 and 7 to start us off.
For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor.
So to government we are to pay tribute, or we would use the word what? Tax. Taxes. And some translations render that. Pay taxes. Also, pay taxes. Taxes are not new to our time, obviously. There were taxes, obviously, in Paul's day. He wouldn't have even said this if there wasn't such a thing as taxes. Tax levied upon houses, tax levied upon property, tax levied even upon people. Where does the government get its money to function? Me and you, right? That's where it gets its money. Some people have a strange idea that the government makes its own money. Well, it may have money printed, but there has to be something to back the paper. If nothing backed the paper, it'd just be paper. So me and you, we fund the government. And we fund the government through, I know we don't necessarily like it, but we fund the government through the taxes that we pay. We fund the living of government workers, whatever government worker position is. They render a service, and they have bills to pay too, obviously, if you work for the IRS or the, I can't think, FBI, CIA, or whatever, White House, whatever. I mean, those folks have bills to pay too, so obviously we're the ones who support the government, and that is because of taxation. And we pointed this out before. It's really a good thing that we have this in place. We could not, out of our own pocket, pave a road, a mile of road. We couldn't do that. We could not fund public transportation out of our own pocket. We could not have sewage, light, and so forth out of our own pocket. And so when you have everybody combined, then you have a society that functions, and all these services can be provided for. Now, I read the other day that our government federal budget from October of this year to the end of September next year, our budget is set at almost $5 trillion. Now, if you want the exact amount, $4,892,000,000 is next year's budget. And I had to use a bigger calculator than normal to try to compute how much that is per day. That is 13, and I didn't compute, yes I did, 13 billion. I'm got all these figures here, and goodness, 13 billion is a big number to me. 13,402,739,726 per day. I'll chip in the $26 a day. I can afford that, but that's about as much as I could go. Over $13 billion a day. Some years the government spends over close to $7 million a minute. And you fellas thought your wives had a spending spree. Little levity, right? Little levity out there, not offending you ladies. Almost $7 million per minute. Is any of that wasteful spending? So much wasteful spending. Here's some examples. Washington will spend $2.6 million training Chinese prostitutes to drink more responsibly on the job. $2.6 million. Washington spends $3 billion resanding beaches only to see the sand what? Go back into the ocean. $3 billion. One program pays farmers $2 billion annually not to what? Farm their land. I'm not farming my yard. I wonder if I can get some of the action there. $2 billion annually not to farm their land. Well, and that's just scratching the surface. You know, that's just a whole lot of wasteful spending, but we are not responsible for that. Our responsibility is to pay the taxes. If it's wasted, that's not our fault. And there are some of our tax dollars we don't like that upon which is spent. But again, we are not responsible for that. We are responsible for paying taxes. Adam, if you will, read for us Matthew 17, 24 through 27. This would be the teachings of Jesus on paying taxes, yes, in his day. Matthew 17, and I know we're familiar with this, but just to sort of refresh us. Matthew 17, 24 through 27.
And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, Doth not your master pay tribute? He said, Yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Their own children or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, Of strangers. And Jesus saith unto him, Then are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast a hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee.
So did Jesus pay tax? Yeah, absolutely he paid tax. He surely did. Now, we would wish that we could pay our taxes the same way, correct? Just go fishing and catch the first fish, and out comes all your tax money for the year, and, well, it doesn't work like that, obviously. But the point is, Jesus himself paid tax. On another occasion, people came to Jesus and asked him if it was lawful to pay tax to Caesar or not. And Jesus said, Render to Caesar what? Things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. And that's, in other words, yes, you are to pay taxes. And of course, Caesar was no saint at that time, and yet they still had an obligation to pay tax to fund the government. So if I'm guilty of tax evasion, am I guilty of a crime? I am guilty of a crime, depending upon the amount. I could, obviously, what little amount I might owe would probably be a slap on the wrist, but, you know, if I owe it a lot, then it could obviously be a hefty fine or even jail time. So we need to pay taxes, is what we're saying here. We may not like it, but it is beneficial. And so that's the teaching of verse 6. Verse 7, back to Romans 13:7, Render therefore to all their dues, tribute or tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom. This is a different type of tax. Some refer to this as import-export type of tax. Fear to whom fear, or you could use the term respect. attitude of respect and subjection to the authorities. When I see the policeman coming my way and the badge he wears, that should gender an attitude of respect of me toward him for, again, the position he holds. And the badge he wears represents people. People, not just a piece of metal, but it represents people that he is protecting, that he has been elected to that office. So respect, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. High and sincere respect. Again, it would be hard to respect the person in charge when Paul wrote this, but yet at the same time, we should respect the office that that person holds, the position that he has. So that sums up verses 1 to 7, the Christian and the law of the land. Any thoughts from you on those first 7 verses?
I think you can point out verses 1 through 7. If you think of that specific scenario, verses 1 through 7, a lot of ways a commentary on the end of chapter 12 about how you relate to your enemy. Because there are a lot of Christians that would have found the authority, that a specific example that a lot of Christians in Rome would have found as their enemy was the government that was directly over them. So a lot of ways, I think, the way it's written, Romans 13, the first 7 verses talking about the government, is a commentary on the end of chapter 12, where Christians are to handle their enemies. And the Roman government, in a lot of ways, was very much like an enemy.
Absolutely. Good point. Very good point. And we know, of course, that God did not put the chapter-verse divisions in the Bible, and man did that, and it's usually helpful, but sometimes it breaks the flow of teaching and thought. So you just connect the end of chapter 12, first part of chapter 13, as Adam said. And a lot of folks did look upon the government, the Roman government especially, as enemies, but we are to not be overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Very good point. Now, in verses 8 to 10 of Romans 13, a much shorter section here, but one nonetheless powerful equally, the Christian and the law of love. So, Adam, if you will, read for us verses 8 through 10.
Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law.
As we just said, men are the ones who put the chapter-verse divisions in. God did not, and so again, that sort of interrupts the thought sometime. But you notice the first part of verse 8 comes immediately after paying what? Taxes. Pay taxes, owe no man anything. So the context is especially talking about when it comes to owing the government. I'm supposed to be paying, obviously, my taxes. Does the phrase, owe no man anything, mean that you can never buy anything on credit? If it means that, most of us will never save up enough money to buy a house. And some people do. But we'd be living on the street if we had to save up enough money right off the bat to buy a house. Now, you can save a lot of money, can't you? If you can save up and buy things without credit, you can save yourself an awful lot of money, but most are not financially able to do that. So, whether it's buying a house or a car, a lot of farmers do what when it comes time to put in a crop? Go to the bank, take the loan out for putting in the crop, and at the end of harvest, they'll pay the loan off by the crops. That's what my neighbor did. I helped him farm, and every spring he'd go to the bank and say, I need this much money to put in my crop this year. And at the end, the agreement is, of course, he'll pay that off when the harvest comes. And of course, he's got his fingers crossed that he has a good harvest. And that's why I'm not a farmer. A lot of pressure, right? A lot of pressure. Though that machinery and all that can be very expensive. So one owes nothing until it is due. One owes nothing until it is due. If something is due on the 5th, what? I need to pay it by the 5th. Now, if I don't pay it by the 5th, then I owe that money. And if I miss a payment, then I want to do everything in my power to pay it as quickly as possible. For the longer I wait in paying it, what happens? Interest. You start accruing interest, and that is compounded. You don't want to do that. If you have a credit card and you get behind on those credit card payments, you need to cut that thing up, put it in the trash, and get that paid off as quickly as possible, because interest will eat you alive. But if I make my payments on time, I don't owe. I do not owe. It's when I don't make my payments, and sometimes we've all been in positions perhaps where we get a bit behind. So a good Christian pays his bills, is the idea behind this. A good Christian pays his bills. And a lot of folks get in trouble in this area. There are preachers who get in trouble in this area. I know of a situation personally when I was growing up where a preacher left town almost in the middle of the night. The congregation wasn't aware of it, and he moved, and he left town owing a lot of people in town a lot of money. How do you think the townspeople looked upon the church? They weren't too happy. I don't know if the church may have actually paid his bills for him. I don't know. But that is a bad reflection on the church. A bad reflection, whether it's a preacher or a member or whomever. This is a problem that has hurt a lot of families. The number one problem in the breakup of marriages is not infidelity, but what? Money. Financial problems, the number one problem in the breakup of marriages, financial issues. So we live in a buy now, pay later society, and we need to be very, very careful in that area. And we want to do our part to pay taxes. We want to do our part to pay our bills, and as best we can to try our best to stay out of just overwhelming debt. But we do owe all men what? Love. Owe no man anything, but we owe all men a debt we can never fully pay off, and that is to love one another. We are never debt-free when it comes to loving our fellow man. Is the point here. A lot of times Jesus summed up the law with what word? Love. Remember the fellow, what commandments should I keep to enter heaven? And Jesus would give the commands there. And then a lawyer came, what's the greatest commandment of all? And Jesus summed it all up with love. Love God, number one. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, he that loveth another has fulfilled the law. In other words, if we get that part right, then everything else is going to fall into place. But if we don't get that right, that's what verse 9 is all about. We are to love one another. If we love one another, we fulfill the law. That is, if we truly love one another, there are things that we will never do. And that's verse 9. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery. We've talked about these terms before. Adultery is a narrower term in which is found fornication. Or in other words, adultery is a narrow term, fornication is a broad term. All adultery is fornication. All fornication is not adultery. Adultery is usually defined as immorality involving a married person and is included with a broader term again, fornication. If I truly love my neighbor, am I going to be after his wife? Or vice versa? I don't. If I truly love my neighbor, I'm not going to commit adultery. Of course, the term adultery today is not called adultery. It's called having an affair. It sounds a lot better, doesn't it? Affair sounds more innocent than the term adultery, but it's all wrong. just did a little research on statistics, and research has found that those who admitted to infidelity at some point in their lives, about 21% of men, about 13% of women, and those are the ones who admitted they had been guilty. And for those found out not admitting, I'm sure the percentages will go up tremendously. If I truly love my neighbor, I'm not going to be after his spouse. Don't commit adultery. If I truly love my neighbor, obviously the next phrase, I'm not going to kill him. You may have a different translation that instead of using the word kill, uses the word murder. That's actually the term here. This is not forbidding self-defense. It is forbidding murder. About every 31 minutes in this land, somebody's murdered. About every 31 minutes, 48 a day, over 17,000 per year are murdered. Where does murder begin? In the heart, in the mind. Again, if I never think it, I will never do it. If I never think it, I will never do it. And so love never seeks to take the life of another. It never seeks to destroy. It seeks to build up. If I love my neighbor, I'm not going to take what belongs to my neighbor for myself. Thou shalt not steal. One home is burglarized every 18 seconds. Do you lock your doors? Every 18 seconds, a home is burglarized. There are those who are bent on getting, not giving, but love is bent on giving, not getting. Thou shalt not steal. If I love my neighbor, I'm not going to lie against him. Or the phrase is what? Bear false witness. Thou shalt not bear false witness. This is the sin of lying about somebody else. Now, if I do this in a courtroom setting, they don't use the term false witness, but I'm guilty of committing what? Perjury. Perjury is lying on the witness stand. And you can get in some hot water for doing that, obviously, depending upon the nature of the crime and the particular trial or so forth. But if I love my neighbor, I'm certainly not going to tell things about my neighbor that aren't true. And if I love my neighbor, there are some things that are true, what? I'm not going to tell either. Keep it to myself, as Sarah said. I'm going to keep it to myself. Some things don't bear repeating, even when they're true. But here, I'm certainly not going to say things about my neighbor that are false. Thou shalt not covet. If I love my neighbor, I'm not going to covet. What does it mean to covet? Well, I want something that belongs to somebody else. Okay, I want something that belongs to somebody else. Oh, John Doe there's got a great looking house. I want that house. I want his lifestyle. I want the car he drives. I want his spouse. I want what belongs to him. That is coveting. Instead of coveting, I need to learn to be content with what? With what I have. I need to learn to be content with what I have, realizing that life is not summed up in things. If I love my neighbor, I'm not going to unlawfully desire things that he has. Notice that Paul says, I'm not going to list every thou shalt not. You get the idea. Isn't that what he's saying? If there be any other commandment, I've given you a representative list. If there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended or summed up in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. What's that rule that goes along with this, that famous rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What do we call that? Golden rule. Now that, the Bible doesn't call it the golden rule, but we've sort of labeled it that, and for good reason. It is a rule that is gold. I don't want somebody taking my wife or taking my life. I don't want somebody lying about me. Therefore what? I'm not going to do it to others. I want people to love me. Therefore I ought to love other people. Love thy neighbor as thyself. There is a proper regard of love for self. You don't hate yourself. You love your neighbor to the same degree that you love yourself. Would that revolutionize the world if everybody would apply this? We're told the Bible is out of touch with men today, out of date. If everybody would just apply what Paul is teaching here, it would revolutionize the world overnight. But where does this start? With me, right? It starts with me. I ought not expect you to do something that I'm not willing to do, so it starts right here. The Christian and the law of love. Verse 10 sums up verse 9. Love works no ill to his neighbor. The word neighbor is an old English word. Of course, a lot of the words we use in English today come from way back in Old English, and we get the word nigh or near from the nay part, and we get the word dwell from the latter part of that, neighbor. So literally, neighbor means a near dweller. But we know from Jesus' teaching that a neighbor isn't just your next door neighbor. We have one on either side of us, to the north and south. We have neighbors on our street. Are they the only neighbors we have? Who did Jesus say our neighbor is? What was that parable? Good Samaritan, right? Remember the fellow who came up and said, well, who's my neighbor, Jesus? And Jesus went on to tell him the parable of the Good Samaritan. We are all each other's neighbor. We are all each other's neighbor. Love wrongs no one. Therefore, you can sum up the law. Instead of all these thou shalt nots, you can sum all that up by the word love, because love would never, ever dream of doing those things. But I've got to start right here. Your thoughts, 8 through 10. The Christian and the law of the land, 1 to 7. The Christian and the law of love, verses 8 through 10. All right, if not, then one last section, verses 11 to 14. The Christian, we're titling this, The Christian and the Law of Living. The Christian and the Law of Living. Adam, if you will, just go ahead and read 11 to 14 for us.
And that knowing the time that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. Put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof.
So verse 11 we could sum up by two words, wake up. Okay, wake up, that's what he's saying in verse 11. Knowing the time, it is time to wake up. Some people are hard to wake up in the morning. And some people just bound out of bed with all the energy in the world. I find myself sort of between those two extremes. I have a sister, when she was growing up, if she's watching, she knows what I'm talking about. She was hard to get up. And she would come to the table every morning, and she was grouchy, would be minimizing her attitude. She would literally slap her face. And I'd sit there and laugh and make fun of her and just make matters worse. And it was, anyway, some people are hard to wake up. Look at sort of an interesting verse. Look, everybody turn to Proverbs 27:14 about people hard to wake up. Proverbs is a treasure trove of wisdom. But this matter of waking people up in the morning, look at what Proverbs 27:14 has to say. Adam, read that for us when you get there.
As the door turneth upon his hinges, so doth the slothful upon his bed. 27,
or if I got the wrong rendering.
That was 26. All right.
That's a good one too.
Yeah, I was going to say. He that blesseth his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, it shall be counted a curse to him.
What's he saying? You walk into somebody's room and they're asleep and you just start yelling and shouting good morning at him. What's the response? Is he going to like it? No, no. So I know those in the military, how are they awakened every morning? What is it called? Revelry, or with the blowing of the bugle and so forth. They don't have much of an option. But if I'm going to wake up my wife, I'm not going to go in there yelling and shouting. I know better. That's what Solomon is saying in Proverbs 27 and verse 14. So back to Romans 13:11, wake up. But he's not talking about getting out of bed in the morning, is he? Not talking about that at all. He's talking about rousing oneself to a better course of conduct, waking up spiritually. Time is passing by, knowing the time. It's high time. It's past time to awake out of spiritual sleep, religious slumber. Wake up spiritually, because our salvation is nearer than when we believed. Talked about this in a sermon not long ago. Every day we live, we are one day closer to what? A lot of things, right? We're one day closer to our death. We're one day closer to eternity. Here, we're one day closer to salvation. And if I'm not prepared, I'm one day closer to condemnation. Each day that passes by, I'm one day nearer to my final destiny. Knowing the time. Time flies, right? Time absolutely flies. We can think of a time in our lives where time just seemed to creep by. Kids in Christmas, they'll start counting down January the 1st, won't they? And each day just seems to drag by and drag by and drag by. Can't wait till I can drive a car. Can't wait till I can graduate from school. Can't wait till I become an adult. And time just drags by. But once we enter into adulthood, how quickly life is passing us by. Unless you've been what for 14 days? Now, for those who've been quarantined for 14 days, I don't care if you're 9 or 90, it seems like an eternity. And knock on wood, whatever, I hadn't been there yet, but that's a long time to be confined to a room. 14 long days. But anyway, other than that, time passes. We need to wake up. We need to wake up. Verse 12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Do what you can with the time you have. This life is almost gone. The night is far spent. The day is at hand, the day of eternal salvation. You have a picture of daybreak is the idea behind this. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness. Get rid of. Cast off, get rid of, right? Put off. Paul says put off the old man and put on the new in other texts. Cast off the works of darkness, put on the armor of light. Christian armor outlined in Ephesians 6. 13, we want to walk honestly. We want to live properly, as in the day. In other words, my life is an open book. And I want to make sure that I'm acting in such a way that if my actions are committed in broad daylight, I'm not ashamed. That's what he's saying here. Walk honestly as in the day. A lot of people commit their sins when? Under cover of darkness or in secret or at night. It may not be true so much now, I don't know. But I want to act in such a way that if it's committed in broad daylight and everybody sees it, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of it. That's how I need to live, honestly. That's how to live and how to walk. How not to walk. I do not need to walk in rioting and drunkenness. Now, I know we use the term rioting today a bit differently than the usage of the word here. Of course, all would be wrong, but the word rioting here, some translate this as carousing. The English Standard Version gives an interesting term, orgies, here. And reveling is also another way to translate this word. This is the behavior that usually follows getting drunk. People who get drunk normally will do things they would never do sober. Okay? These are sins that go hand in hand. Rioting and drunkenness, the use of strong drink. Since we know that this type of this liquor is so damaging and wrong, why is it still around? What's the answer? It's big business. It's money. We know that improper use of drugs is wrong, and illegal drugs are wrong. Why are they around? Money. If there were no money involved, they wouldn't be around. It's money, money, money is the name of the game here. And so, there is a prohibition party. I think in 2016 they were on our ballot for president. One was running for president from the Prohibition Party. I came mighty close to circling that in. For my vote that year, I didn't, but I came mighty close to doing that. And what are the odds the Prohibition Party will ever put somebody in the White House? About the same as me getting the White House. That's about the odds of that. This type of living and sinning go hand in hand. We are out of time. I meant to cover all the chapter. We'll wrap this up in a couple of weeks, and we'll just pick back up in verse 13 about the last part of that section there. And we'll wrap up this chapter and then look at the chapter that deals with matters of option, Romans 14.